Committee will come to order. The purpose of today's hearing is to explore how we can save billions of dollars by shrinking our federal real estate footprint. I think we have a tremendous opportunity this year to come up with a bipartisan bill that gains the support of the House, the Senate, and the President. We have the same goal: to get excess and underutilized properties out of the hands of government and onto the local tax rolls or local service providers. This can be a win-win solution for the taxpayer, local governments, and homeless assistance providers. Let me thank Chairman Chaffetz of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform for working closely with this committee on this important issue. He planned to be here to testify, but unfortunately was called at the last minute to work on another crucial issue. Without objection, I would like to submit his written statement for the record. I also want to thank Chairman Denham for his work and leadership on this issue. And finally, I want to thank all of our witnesses and particularly OMB Controller Mader for being here today. We know reducing the federal real estate footprint is a critical issue and can result in real and significant savings for the taxpayer. For example, since the beginning of last Congress, our committee has saved more than $2.5 billion by approving leases and other projects that reduce and consolidate space. That was no small feat, and it took this committee working with GSA and OMB to realize those savings. Our subcommittee has hosted a series of roundtables working with GSA to send the message of optimizing space and replacing expiring leases with good long-term deals. In some ways, the lease side of federal real estate is easier to address. When leases expire, an opportunity is created to reduce space and negotiate good lease deals to lower costs. And with 100 million square feet of leased space expiring in the next 5 years, 50% of GSA's leased inventory, the opportunity for taxpayer savings is huge. In light of that, I recently introduced the Public Buildings Reform and Savings Act, which will create a leasing pilot program GSA can use to cut the best deals for the taxpayer. Today, however, we are focusing on a much more difficult problem: getting rid of federal real estate we no longer need. According to the most recent federal real property summary, the government owns more than 254,000 buildings, comprising 2.5 billion square feet of space, costing the taxpayer $14.4 billion annually. However, we are also told in the same summary that only 5,000 buildings are actually underutilized, despite the fact that 27,000 assets are labeled as inactive. It is clear the data needs improving, but it is also clear, based on work by GAO and others, that there are a lot of vacant or underutilized buildings across the nation that go unreported. We don't have to look far to see prime examples of this right here in Washington. Just down the street sits the vacant Continental Annex on land worth more than $100 million. On Pennsylvania Avenue, it took more than a decade and an act of Congress to turn the money-losing old post office building into a profit center for the taxpayer. The West Heating Plant in Georgetown sat vacant for more than a decade, and it wasn't until this committee shined a spotlight on it that GSA finally sell it for almost $20 million. When these properties sit vacant or underutilized, no one wins. The agencies and taxpayer pay to maintain them, no tax dollars are infused into the local economies, and they are not made available for sale or even screened for other purposes, such as to serve the homeless. Previous estimates indicate we are wasting more than $1.6 billion a year on these properties. But if GAO reports are any indication, this is probably a low estimate. Today, we hope to hear from our witnesses. What is the scope of the problem? What are the obstacles to reducing the real estate footprint? And how do we overcome these hurdles? A few challenges we have seen include upfront costs to make properties available, including money to move people out of underutilized buildings, land banking, agencies holding on to valuable but vacant properties because they think someday they may need them, and a disposal process that is cumbersome, time-consuming, and keeps properties from being sold. Chairman Chaffetz and Chairman Denham, in the past, have each offered proposals to address these issues, and I am pleased to see them working together on this issue. The administration proposed legislation in 2011 and reiterated the importance of that legislation in the fiscal year 2016 budget. In fact, in the fiscal year 2016 budget, the administration states that despite the progress made through efforts like Freeze the Footprint, an independent board would allow us to achieve long-desired opportunities for reform and deficit reduction. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses here today. We have a great opportunity to finally get a bipartisan bill through Congress and address this long-standing problem. Now, I understand we may have some members who sit on our full committee who may want to participate in today's hearings. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing, offer testimony, and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. I now call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, and welcome to this afternoon's hearing. Today we'll examine the GSA's implementation of the administration's policy on restraining the growth of the federal real estate footprint. We will also look at possible impediments to improving these efforts. In 2003, the GAO placed real property management on its list of high-risk governmental activities, where it remains today. Both these committee and GAO have repeatedly expressed serious concerns about how federal real property has been managed. I am pleased, therefore, that the administration has made a concerted effort to right-size the federal real estate portfolio. First, the Office and Management and Budget issued, or OMB, a memorandum requiring all federal agencies to freeze their federal real estate footprints. Secondly, the administration proposed legislation to create a board that would operate similar to the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, or BRAC, to expedite the sale of underutilized and excess properties. Thirdly, the administration has released further guidance that federal agencies should reduce their footprint. It has been very clear that the administration is serious about addressing these high-risk activities. However, the CBO and various former GSA officials have raised concerns about the potential effectiveness or need for this proposed board. These former senior officials have testified before other committees and have consistently questioned whether there is a real problem or not. They've questioned whether a significant number of underutilized federal properties that actually warrant the creation of a new federal bureaucracy. GAO has also raised concerns about reliability of the data and the federal real property profile, which describes most of the real property owned by the federal government and is considered by OMB to be a key management tool. Without a rigorous inventory and analysis, it is impossible to know whether the federal government is really sitting on billions of dollars of underutilized properties and if there is a market for these properties at all. As the federal government's landlord, GSA has a responsibility to guide agencies toward making good decisions that reflect both the will of the administration and Congress. The federal government must make better decisions on how to house these federal agencies. With the advent of hoteling, alternate work schedules, and teleworking, it is very possible for federal agencies to have a smaller footprint than ever, as the need for federal workers to be in one fixed location decreases. I remain open to a legislative fix if that is what is necessary to address the real documented concerns about the management of real property. However, I also want to ensure that any legislation offers the proper protections for the current stakeholders in the disposal process while improving the process for disposition of real property. These important stakeholders include homeless service providers and municipalities eligible for public benefit conveyances. So, I'm especially interested in whether or not the current guidelines are working as Congress intended to allow homeless service providers an appropriate opportunity to make use of surplus or underutilized federal properties to address the devastating problems of homelessness, particularly among returning veterans. So I look forward to the testimony of today's witnesses to help us evaluate the need for legislation to dispose of federal property that might be surplus or underutilized. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. On our first panel today, we have the Honorable Jeff Denham, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. And I ask unanimous consent that our witness's full statement be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Chairman Denham, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Barletta. Mr. Carson, for allowing me to testify today. And first, let me commend Chairman Barletta on his efforts to not only authoring but passing a bipartisan bill with Public Building Savings and Reform Act of 2015. Your leadership on this issue has helped us in this time to not only in decreasing our national debt, but getting rid of some of the government inefficiency. I'd also like to thank Chairman Schuster and Chairman Chaffetz for working with me on this issue to ensure that it receives the proper oversight and attention. Reducing our nation's national debt is a bipartisan issue, and I've been proud to work over the last several years to not only get a bipartisan resolution, but get one that goes across multiple committees to garner enough support to actually move this along. Legislation to reform the federal property disposal process would create a nonpartisan professional board to root out waste and inefficiencies in the way that we manage our public buildings. The principles of this bill are the driving forces behind the effort to redevelop the Federal Triangle and serve as a model for how we manage property nationwide. I first proposed reforming the federal property disposal process at this subcommittee's first hearing in February 2011, and the President proposed similar ideas in his 2012 budget. I'm pleased to see the President has continued his support of these reforms, speaking to it not only in his 2011 State of the Union speech, but also including it once again in his 2016 budget that he submitted to Capitol Hill. Likewise, I'm pleased to have secured the commitment of this administration to advance legislation and work with myself and Chairman Chaffetz to see real reforms actually signed into law. In recent years, the GAO identified billions of dollars of waste through mismanagement over buildings and an over-reliance on costly leased space to meet long-term housing needs. Additionally, both houses of Congress have included the idea in their annual budget documents. I believe the potential to save billions of dollars is real. To be successful, the board will need to implement 5 principles. First, to consolidate the footprint of the federal real estate. Second, house more federal employees in less overall space. Third, reduce our reliance on costly leased space. Fourth, sell or redevelop high-value assets that are underutilized or too valuable for housing federal employees. And fifth, and most importantly, to dispose of surplus property quickly. I believe a Board of Citizens that uses these 5 principles to guide its decisions can see over $15 billion in initial savings. To be clear, we're not looking to create a fire sale of vacant properties or overload the marketplace. Simply dumping vacant properties on the market is not a long-term solution. Additionally, some members have talked about this as being a BRAC-like process. We've listened to these concerns over the years and continue to work on this legislation. To begin with, BRAC relocated thousands of people, families, and entire communities. BRAC removed an economic engine from cities across the country. This legislation will not relocate one family. It will not destroy one single community. Instead, we will bring new economic life and development into federal space that has long been neglected. Finally, the decision on these properties today belongs to OMB, and through this legislation will remain with OMB. What we would like to do is reshape the way this country manages the federal real estate footprint. At the end of the day, the total cost to house the federal government is directly proportional to how much real estate we hold. To save money, we will have to consolidate that footprint. To consolidate, we must house more federal employees in less space. Fortunately, there are tremendous opportunities of savings in this area. Perhaps one of the greatest areas for taxpayer savings will be in the redevelopment or sale of the high-valued but underutilized properties. For instance, the ones that Chairman had talked about, the abandoned, underutilized properties here in D.C. from the Georgetown West Heating Plant and the old post office. They were both vacant, in decay, costing taxpayers millions of dollars a year as they sat idle and unused. First hearing that we held was in the old post office. I remember being a new freshman wearing a California suit in the middle of the winter, and it was 32, it was below zero, freezing temperatures in that cold building sitting vacant. I know there's some people in here that remember very fondly the cold atmosphere of that vacant building that is now being redeveloped. Through the attention that was paid by this committee, GSA was able to sell one and lease the other to private entities that will bring new business and economic activity right here to the D.C. area. There are high-value properties like this all across the entire country. We can use this as an example. Maximizing value is what we seek to achieve. I believe this guiding principle, along with the 5 objectives I've outlined earlier, should help us to redevelop and push this legislation along. I thank the committee again and look forward to working with you on this issue as we move forward.
Thank you for your testimony. Your leadership and commitment to this issue is critical. We'll now call our second panel of witnesses. Thank you. We have with us today the Honorable Dave Mader, Controller, Office of Management and Budget, Mr. Norman Dong, Commissioner, Public Building Service, U.S. General Service Administration, and Mr. David J. Wise, Director of Physical Infrastructure Team, United States Government Accountability Office. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Mader, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the committee and subcommittee for inviting me to testify and update the subcommittee on the changes that we are implementing to improve the government's real property management and overall efficiency of the real property portfolio. I'd like to update you on the status of the initiatives that I mentioned when I testified last July in front of the House Subcommittee on Government Operations regarding the administration's effort to improve the management of the government's real property portfolio. Over the past 11 months, we have continued to implement actions that will improve and transform the way the federal government manages its real property. Our plan includes 4 key components. First, develop and implement a strategic framework that will guide agencies' management of their real property portfolios over the next 5 years. Second, develop and implement government-wide performance metrics that will identify efficiency opportunities at the agency level and to assess the performance of individual agencies. Third, develop a new management tool within the current federal real property profile to enhance the utility and quality of that data. Fourth, modifications to existing statutes to increase the pace and number of property disposals, which will decrease the amount of resources expended on maintaining excess and underutilized properties. The President's 2016 budget invests in our federally owned facilities to ensure that mission execution is optimized at the lowest possible cost, including $2.4 billion over the FY15 enacted level to support critical construction and renovation projects, as well as opportunities for consolidation in the federal building inventory. We have completed or made significant progress on 3 of the 4 components. We issued the National Real Property Strategy in March of 2015, which builds on past actions and results to define the strategic framework that agencies will use to manage their portfolio. The framework will freeze the growth of the inventory, measure performance and identify opportunities to improve efficiency and data quality, and finally, to reduce the size of the inventory by prioritizing actions to consolidate, co-locate, and dispose of properties. To implement the national strategy, we have issued a new policy that provides a set of agency-specific performance metrics. The Reduce the Footprint policy, issued also in March, requires agencies to implement a 5-year plan to reduce their real property portfolios. The Reduce the Footprint prioritizes the disposal of unneeded and inefficient properties by requiring agencies to set annual square foot disposal targets for all types of buildings. It also requires agencies to issue office space design standards by March of next year, 2016, and to use this standard as a design criteria going forward. The last component of our plan, potential modification to existing statutes, could increase the pace and the number of properties disposed of through sale, demolition, and public benefit conveyance. These modifications could include, but are not limited to, agency retention of some of the sale proceeds for reinvestment in additional disposals, expanded authority for GSA to support agencies' work to prepare properties for a declaration of excess, and relief from some of the aspects of the public benefit conveyance process. All of the components of our plan, except, of course, for the potential modifications to the existing statutes, will be implemented by the end of this fiscal year, 2015. We believe these actions will significantly improve the management of real property and deliver efficiency gains over the next 5 years. The Real Property Program has achieved results in 2014, and we will continue to build on this achievement. We reduced the Freeze the Footprint baseline by 11.2 million square feet in 2014, and this result builds on the 10.2 million square foot reduction we achieved in 2013. So 2 years combined, we reduced 21 million square feet of office and warehouse space. It's important to note that in order for the government to reduce our footprint, we require funding to make the necessary reconfigurations and relocations that will result in out-year cost avoidance. We have made progress, however, significant opportunities remain. One significant challenge has been the historically low levels of funding appropriated to the GSA Federal Building Fund. The GSA is leading the federal effort to both invest in federal facilities and consolidate space to reduce costs and optimize efficiency, avoiding tens of millions of dollars in annual lease costs. Recent funding levels for the GSA and other federal landholding agencies have led both to facility deterioration as well as missed opportunities to consolidate and reduce operating costs. As I stated in my hearing last summer, I think we need to think about the concept of investing to save. We look forward to working with the subcommittee on legislation that will enable us to make even greater progress by improving the efficiency of government-wide portfolio and accelerating the pace of property disposals over the next few years. Thank you for the opportunity of testifying today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. They've just called votes. We have a two-vote series. So we're going to recess until we can return from these votes in about 20, 25 minutes. The subcommittee is in recess. Meeting will come to order. We will pick up where we left off. Mr. Dong, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to the hearing this afternoon. Our mission at GSA is to deliver the best value in real estate, acquisition, and technology to the federal government. And within the Public Building Service, our goal is to support agency real property requirements, but in the most fiscally responsible way. We recognize that excess spending on real estate comes at the expense of more mission-critical activities. And as agencies spend less on rent, they can devote more of their limited dollars to support mission requirements. To do this, we're consolidating space and improving space utilization. We're taking a more disciplined approach to leasing. We're disposing of unneeded assets. We are leveraging our exchange and outleasing authorities. And we're supporting OMB in the government-wide effort not just to freeze, but to reduce the federal footprint. On the issue of space utilization, we're working with federal agencies to identify opportunities to co-locate, consolidate, and reduce the footprint. Since fiscal year 14, Congress has provided $70 million each year to support agency consolidation projects. Many of these projects reflect agencies moving out of expensive leased facilities into federally owned space. In Minneapolis, for example, we're partnering with HUD to move them out of leased space into the federal building in that city. Through this process, HUD will reduce its footprint by over 9,000 square feet, which will save the government more than $700,000 each year. And today, we're executing dozens of projects that will reduce the federal footprint by almost 800,000 square feet and reduce annual leasing costs by about $50 million. And given significant agency interest in this program, our budget request for fiscal year 16 will help us further reduce our square footage and increase our annual cost savings. As we emphasize the importance of federally owned space, we will continue to see a significant amount of leasing activity. So our job at GSA is not just to make sure that we're reducing the footprint, but also the cost of that footprint. And by embracing greater competition in our leasing transactions, we can capitalize on favorable rates that we're still seeing in many markets. In order to get better leasing rates for the government, GSA is working with our federal tenants to simplify their space requirements and broaden delineated areas to increase competition. To extend lease terms to 10 years or longer whenever possible, because longer terms usually mean lower rates. And to start the planning process at least 36 months prior to lease expiration to allow for competitive procurements and to avoid costly holdovers and extensions. We see that whenever we are in holdover or extension, we're paying about 20% more than we should on average. In recent years, we've made some good progress to reduce the number of holdovers and extensions. And by the end of fiscal year 14, we had only 97 holdovers out of more than 8,700 leases, which was the lowest figure since 2007. On the issue of underutilized property, we are improving our efforts to identify assets we no longer need and to move these properties off our books. In fiscal year 14, GSA disposed of 342 properties government-wide, which represented a 61% increase from the year before. And this year, we're on track to meet our goal of disposing of 3 million square feet of excess property, which includes the Metro West building in Baltimore. We're seeing some progress here, but we recognize that there's much more that we can and should be doing. GSA is also leveraging our exchange and outleasing authorities to tap into the value of those assets that no longer serve a federal purpose, but still represent significant value to the private sector. In Southwest D.C., we're leveraging the value of our regional office building and the Cotton Annex in the Federal Triangle Complex. Through this exchange project, GSA is seeking construction and development services to modernize the rest of our headquarters building and to further the DHS consolidation at the St. Elizabeth's campus. Another example is our long-term lease of the old post office building to the Trump Organization, which is transforming it into a luxury hotel. This private investment of $200 million will preserve this historic building, serve the local community, and generate lease revenues for the government. I'd like to close by discussing how GSA is supporting the administration's national strategy for real estate. This summer, GSA will be working with OMB to review agency plans to reduce the footprint. And through this process, we will build upon our work in fiscal year 15 and will develop a robust pipeline of potential projects for disposal, exchange, and outlease beginning next year. We've made significant progress in managing federal real property, but we recognize there is much more work that must be done. I look forward to working with this committee to improve federal government's management of real property. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Dong. Mr. Wise, you may proceed.
Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work on how the federal government's real property management practices could be improved. The government's real property holdings are vast. The portfolio comprises hundreds of thousands of buildings and a comparable number of permanent structures. My statement today focuses on 1. Improvements and challenges in federal real property management, and 2. Executive and legislative steps that could help the government address these challenges. Since GAO placed federal real property management on the high-risk list in 2003, the government has given the issue high-level attention, including establishing the Federal Real Property Council and the Federal Real Property Profile, which is the government's real property database, implementing the 2012 Freeze the Footprint policy aimed at keeping federal office and warehouse inventory at a baseline level established using FRPP data, issuing this past March 2015-2020 National Strategy for the Efficient Use of Real Property. The strategy includes freeze growth in the inventory, measuring performance, and reducing growth through consolidation, co-location, and disposal. Notwithstanding these positive steps, the government continues to face challenges in managing its real property portfolio, including maintaining more real property than it needs, relying on leasing when ownership would be more cost-effective, and making real property management decisions using unreliable data. Retaining unneeded real property results in significant costs to the federal government. In July 2014, the administration released the first-year results of the Freeze the Footprint policy, indicating that it reduced the federal government's office and warehouse space by about 10 million square feet between fiscal years 2012 and 13, which exceeded its goals. However, we found that the data behind these results were unreliable, resulting in a potential overstatement of the progress made. For example, some properties credited as having been disposed of by agencies were actually returned to GSA and remain part of the federal inventory. The government continues to rely heavily on leasing where ownership would be more cost-effective in the long run. In our February 2015 high-risk update, we reported that the government has demonstrated a leadership commitment by trying to consolidate high-value leases and smaller leases as they expire. However, we noted that GSA lacked an action plan and transparent data to demonstrate progress in achieving this goal. Consistent and accurate data are critical to effectively manage real property. Despite leadership commitment to improve FRPP, the government continues to face challenges with its accuracy and consistency. In 2012, we reported that FRPP data did not consistently describe excess and underutilized federal real property. While the government has taken some steps to improve FRPP, additional improvements are needed, including better accuracy of utilization, space reductions reported by agencies, maintenance needs, and tracking of structures. 3 key steps could assist the way forward: implementing the national strategy, which I mentioned earlier, implementing key GAO recommendations, and considering legislation to assist the disposal process and mitigate competing stakeholder interests. In recent years, we've made a number of recommendations to GSA that, if implemented, should improve real property management and reduce costs. Some priority recommendations include: in June 2012, we recommended steps GSA could take to make the FRPP database a better decision-making tool. GSA agreed and is implementing measures aimed at improving its reliability and usefulness. This effort is ongoing. In July 2012, we recommended that GSA develop a 5-year capital plan to help ensure that long-term goals are fully considered when making decisions to fund capital projects. GSA agreed, but conveyed that the challenging budget environment in recent years has limited the agency's ability to develop such a plan. In November 2014, we recommended that GSA develop a clear strategy to effectively manage the government's vast warehouse portfolio. GSA agreed and is developing appropriate guidance. We'll continue to monitor the implementation of these and our other real property recommendations. Since 2011, there have been several real property reform bills introduced in the Congress. None has been enacted. One of the bills, the Civilian Property Realignment Act, CIPRA, provided a framework for disposing of and consolidating civilian real property. The Excess Federal Building and Property Disposal Act would have created a pilot project for expedited disposal of a limited number of high-value properties through public auction. More recently, the Public Building Savings and Reform Bill would codify the freeze the footprint policy goals for high-value projects and place limitations on an agency's ability to enter into private sector leases, among other things. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the committee, this completes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Wise. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are any additional questions following the first round, we'll proceed with the second round. Mr. Dong, I want to thank you again for working with us on a leasing side. Before we get into the owned side, I did want to alert you that I am still hearing that the standard GSA lease is just 5 years, which, as you know, is more costly than long-term lease deals. What are you doing to get the GSA regions to lock in the long-term deals? And also, with 50% of your leases expiring in the next 5 years, GSA should be using all the tools in your toolbox. However, I'm still not seeing many leases being tasked to the brokers. And what are you doing to address this?
Chairman Barletta, I think you're raising a really interesting point here. And since I've been commissioner over the past 15 months, I've underscored the importance of broader delineated areas and longer lease terms and greater competition, all in the name of being able to get better rates. But I think what we want to be able to do is not just say what's important, but to actually follow through with the regions to make sure that they are doing what's important. And we're taking a much more of a hands-on role to actually have those follow-on discussions with the regions, to review the transactions one by one, to ask the questions in terms of, all right, tell me what you're doing about delineated area. Tell me what you're doing about lease term. We actually, over the past few months, have been doing reviews of past transactions, region by region. What we will do going forward is to review the future pipeline of expiring leases and really make sure that agencies are adhering to the guidance that we have articulated at headquarters to make sure that we are landing in the right place for those larger transactions.
And as far as working with the brokers,
we've talked in earlier settings about how we have a significant amount of work in front of us in terms of the expiring lease pipeline. And again, we don't want to be in a situation where we continue to put more time on the clock through extensions, because that costs us, as we've talked about before, a 20% premium. So as we look at the workload region by region, one of the questions that we're bringing to that discussion is, tell me how you're going to use the broker contracts as a resource here, because we have no excuse not to use the brokers. We need to be leveraging every single resource at our disposal to manage the workload and to get the best rates.
Mr. Mayor, last week, OMB Director Donovan committed to members of this committee to working with us and Chairman Chaffetz to advance legislation to reform the way the federal government manages property. Specifically, we seek to consolidate the federal footprint, sell or redevelop high-value, underutilized space, and dispose of property more quickly. Now, the President has also included property disposal legislation as a priority issue in his annual budget. We appreciate the President's focus on this issue and agree that the time has come to address the backlog of unneeded property. Can you confirm that the administration will work with us to move legislation through Congress that incorporates those ideals?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. Not only does the administration support better leveraging the real property portfolio, but I think we've demonstrated through proposing in multiple budgets now for several years the CIPRA legislation that David Wise talked about. So I think we're all shooting for the same objective, and I think it's just a matter of how do we sort of dock all these ships together. This morning, Norm and I had an opportunity to testify over in the Senate with Chairman Johnson and Senator Carper. Same topic. They have an interest. They want to do something. So I think, it's just a matter of getting all the stars aligned, because I think everybody's shooting for the same objective here.
Mr. Wise, does the federal government own civilian property that it does not need or underutilizes? And is significant taxpayer money spent on these properties every year? Is this a significant problem? Is legislation required to address it?
In brief, in a little bit to expand on that, yes, it's clearly we've shown, and I think that testimony from the administration has also shown that there's a lot of unneeded and underutilized property out there. Exactly how much, we don't really know. Is it costing taxpayers money to maintain and secure it and guard it and so forth? Yes. Legislation, there are certain things we've talked about in the past and in some of our reports. There's a lot of things the administration can do, but there are some things that the federal agencies are really unable to do. And we see this as basically kind of a cooperative effort. There's both a federal side as well as an agency side and a legislative side. And where I think the legislative side can come into play is through some elements that we already knew about from CIPRA, where it can deal with some of the problems that inhibit the disposal process, primarily trying to either neutralize a little bit or at least mitigate some of the competing stakeholder interests. And that's where a CIPRA-like, or at least a legislative remedy, could be very useful in partnering with the federal agencies to help move the disposal process.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Dong and Mr. Mader, can you provide specific examples of when the federal government was unable to dispose of a valuable piece of property because of conflicting stakeholder interest that you believe to be emblematic of this problem nationwide?
Congressman, let me start, and then I think Norm probably has a couple examples. I recently had an opportunity to visit with the Veterans Administration. OMB does an annual review of agency operations. Last week we sat with Deputy Secretary Sloan and his top leadership, and one of the topics of each and every one of these reviews, and we're about halfway through the cabinet level departments now, focuses on real property, on the amount of space they hold, number of buildings. In the case of the VA, obviously, they're a very large landholding and building occupying agency, and rightfully so because of the critical mission that they provide. But what was interesting in that conversation was the level of frustration that they talked about, where they have facilities that they're looking to replace, and yet, they receive opposition from the community to actually replace it. And there were a couple that they mentioned in particular where they said, we have the funding to build a new facility, but the community doesn't, they really like this old facility, or we can consolidate a facility and turn that building over to GSA for redevelopment. And the community says, we really just like to keep the VA hospital. So I think one of the challenges, and Norm has lots of other examples, is how do you sort of leverage the interest of all the parties in a way that we can actually achieve what we share with you is reducing the footprint.
Congressman Carson, my colleague from OMB was talking about some of the challenges in managing the various stakeholder interests. I wanted to answer the question focused on what we see as some other obstacles as well. And I think a key obstacle for us in this process is that whole notion of retention of proceeds. And what we see as agencies look to identify properties to move off their books is that they incur costs. There's a cost of doing that. There's an upfront cost of doing that. And if they have no ability to retain any proceeds to at least recover their costs, it makes it very difficult. We actually see some examples in the federal government where you do have agencies that have some limited retention of proceeds authority. The Coast Guard is one example. The Forest Service is another example. And with those two agencies, you're seeing far more volume, far more disposition activity among those agencies because they're able to recoup their costs.
I think, if I might add one more item, in the current fiscal year, the Congress authorized GSA to spend $70 million out of the federal building fund to do building consolidations. And I think this goes to the chairman's comment about, and GAO's critique about moving out of expensive lease facilities. So GSA had last year and then again this year $70 million, and they've done, and Norm can talk about the progress they've made over the last 2 years. But in the president's budget for 16, that's pending, we've asked for $200 million. There's a lot more we can do if we could invest in it. And what we're hearing is, in fact, not only are we not going to get the 200, we're not even going to get the 70. So you got to wonder, can we actually expect GSA to make any progress when we're not providing the resources to them?
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Wise, given the problems you have identified with the federal real property profile and that a significant portion of its data is effectively unreliable, do you think it's possible to put together a commission that would have the ability to scour the federal real estate inventory in a systematic way?
Congressman Carson, the issue with the federal real property profile is, as you say, the data. We've done a lot of engagements, and almost in every one we found issues with various aspects of the federal real property profile. But beyond just the pure data being an issue, there's also, as we turned over the rocks of the federal real property profile, we found that there were some real issues with how the data is collected and the congruency of the various agencies' definitions of what constitutes utilization or non-utilization or building condition. And so we have a very wide-ranging kind of set of circumstances involved with many different agencies and even sometimes bureaus within those agencies putting data into this system, but not all clearly defined in the same way. So naturally, when things go in with some lack of consistency, they're certainly going to come out inconsistently as well. And so we find all sorts of anomalies with the data, but I think that as we see a very strong management commitment, both from GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy as well as from OMB under the leadership of Dave and his staff, of trying to come up with ways to harmonize the collection data practices and definitions so that we can so that the data itself can be drawn on a more parallel basis, which hopefully will then improve the overall database. So it's really quite a deep problem beyond just the numbers themselves coming out. It's kind of the foundation of it that really needs to be worked on, and we do know that process is ongoing at GSA, and we're hopeful that when we go to evaluate it on the next round of the high risk our next update for 2017, that we'll see some significant improvements as we go to test the data and its reliability.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now start our second round of questioning. This is to all witnesses. As I said in my opening statement, I think there are 4 basic reasons that we can't get rid of real estate that we don't need. 1, agencies are land banking valuable properties. 2, it costs agencies more to sell a property than it will generate in sale proceeds. 3, you have to relocate people from underutilized properties first. And 4, the disposal process takes too long and results in few sales. To address these problems, it would seem that we need 1, an independent body to recommend properties for sale. 2, the proceeds from the high-value properties to pay for the upfront costs of selling the less valuable properties. 3, GSA's real estate authorities to relocate people off underutilized but valuable property. And 4, to streamline the disposal process. Do you agree these are the fundamental problems and solutions that Congress has to address?
Mr. Chairman, I think what you just articulated is very consistent with the themes that exist within our proposed CIPRA legislation. So I think we're, again, I know I sound like a broken record. I mean, I think we're all in alignment on what the end game is and how to get there. I think it's a matter of just tweaking the pieces and moving forward.
Okay. Mr. Dung?
I would concur with what Mr. Mader said.
Mr. Wise?
continue the broken record, I pretty much agree with what Dave and Norm said. In fact, when you were describing, you were saying it sounded a lot like zipper legislation. So those are all elements I think are important to helping the process move forward and hopefully kind of rationalize the whole federal property profile.
Sorry for not recognizing Mrs. Norton in the first round of questions. Mrs. Norton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tipped on in, so I can understand that. I very much appreciate this hearing, Mr. Chairman, however, and I would like to pose a question first off to Mr. Wise. Mr. Wise, this question really is about how. You know, it's easy enough to point out all the things that we wish GSA would do. It becomes far more, sometimes too hard to do it. Sometimes GSA has authority and won't do it. Perhaps sometimes the Congress needs to make clear or to offer authority. I noted on page 4 of your own testimony, and here I'm quoting from it, you said the federal government continues to rely heavily on leasing of properties where it would be more cost-effective in the long run for the federal government to own. That's the kind of mantra, virtually, of this committee. But, you know, it's easy enough to say that. It's been difficult to do it. If we were to point to agencies where this becomes hard to avoid, we might point to the consolidation of the Department of Homeland Security, where the government continues to spend billions of dollars. And when it's all done, it'll be perhaps untold billions because of the delay that Congress has put onto moving here. But I noted that DHS is still in 55 locations in this very high lease national capital region. When consolidation fully occurs, they will be down to something like 6 to 9 leases. You know, one can calculate the kind of savings in lease costs that amounts to. One would imagine that sooner rather than later is when we'd want to proceed. If this doesn't add to the deficit, I don't know what does, at least in terms of money that we could extract. So I'd like, perhaps beginning with Mr. Wise, to ask, could not GSA, does it have the authority to fully use incoming rent funds to construct new facilities that could help with consolidation?
Congresswoman Norton, the issue with the Federal Buildings Fund, of course, is that there's an accumulation of money going into it, but GSA is not able to expend that money on capital projects without the authorization of Congress.
All right, let me stop you there. If Congress were to authorize spending of money we already have in the building fund, then GSA could move more rapidly to free us from these costly leases.
If Congress authorized GSA to spend the money as Congress directed, then GSA could proceed forward with spending that money on whatever capital project was authorized.
Do both of you agree, Mr. Don, Mr. Miller?
Absolutely.
Yes, it comes back to having full access to the rents that we collect. The Federal Buildings Fund was set up so that the rent that we collect from our tenant agencies gets reinvested back into the federal portfolio. We're not seeing full access. Those dollars are being diverted for other purposes.
What kind of purposes?
Be other purposes outside of federal buildings.
Well, I can understand for rehabilitation, for maintaining properties, but I wonder if one could even cite a purpose that could save the government more money than authorization by this committee to use at least some of those funds to hasten. Otherwise, we're depending upon the appropriations. And that's very difficult to do, appropriations from Congress of the United States. When we got this money lying right here that could be used, and Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask that we at least take a close look at that so that we don't continue simply to criticize GSA for doing something it can't help but doing for lack of authorization from our own committee. Mr. Blue, I want to thank, or is it Mr. Dong, who was with me at the roundtable I had on holdover leases.
I believe it was our regional commissioner, Darren Blue, who was with you at that
It was
session.
Darren Blue. Yes. When he, I was pleased to hear that the holdover leases, the number of holdover leases, these costly, perhaps the most costly of leases, had decreased. But it looks like the way we've done it is to increase the number of short-term leases, at least in this region. And of course, I point to this region where perhaps the lion's share of your leases are. What would it take to get off of these short-term leases? Is it because of the footprint requirements? Why are you doing short-term leases which in and of themselves are guaranteed to cost the federal government more in funds?
I think you're raising a really good point. And I think what we see is whenever there's holdover or extension or even succeeding leases, whenever we take a stay-in-place strategy and we send a strong message to the market that we want to stay in place, then we shouldn't be surprised when we're getting less than competitive rates. So we're trying to make sure that we apply much more discipline and rigor to the planning process so that we get agency requirements early on in the process. At least we got to start the planning process at least 36 months before lease expiration, and we need to be much more disciplined in terms of running that competitive process so the market knows that we're serious about getting the best rates for the taxpayer.
So what's the average for a short-term lease?
We see lease extensions that are like 2 years or 3 years, and sometimes they make sense. So when we do a lease extension because we are moving that tenant to a federally owned building, then that's a clear strategy that makes sense because we've got a longer-term solution to have them in an owned facility.
Would that were possible more often? Go ahead.
When we see lease extensions where we have not done the planning and we're simply putting more time on the clock and we don't have a clear plan for what happens next, that's the wrong approach.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over time. I wish you would submit to the chairman how you and how you are implementing this longer term out, so that in fact you engage in fewer short-term leases, so the committee will understand when this is happening, how often it is happening, and how many short-term leases have been affected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now resume our second round of questioning. I just have one more question. Mr. Mader, the administration advocates for an independent board to achieve, quote, long-desired opportunities for reform and deficit reduction within the inventory with far greater scope, speed, and efficiency. Can you talk about why an independent board is important?
I think, Mr. Chairman, an independent board would allow us to bring in outside expertise, folks that have, worked in the private sector, who have dealt with large real property portfolios. And I think the combination of the outside expertise along with GSA and other, let's say, other landholding agencies would allow us to sort of step back and think differently about how we look at properties, how we think about bundling portfolios of properties. This past year, working with GSA, it's interesting, GSA only has control over 19% of the inventory, which I think is a surprise when people hear that low number. They just think GSA runs everything. The fact of the matter is they don't. You have NASA, you have DOD, you have agriculture. So what we did between us and GSA is actually got these landholding agencies together and said, look, we all have disposals, but what we're doing is we're doing them in our stovepipes and we're doing them as one-offs. What if we looked at a geographic area and said, you know, who's got excess property in these 5 counties? Is it more attractive to sell a portfolio than a single property? Maybe. So I think a board brings that creativity and different way of thinking. And I also think it takes away some of the parochialism that just is inherent in the government. You know, like, well, we've never done it that way before. So I think it's a combination of that outside experience and the inside expertise.
Thank you. I have no further questions. I recognize Ranking Member Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Dong and Mr. Mader, how often do federal agencies, unprompted by GSA or even OMB, offer up excess real estate for disposal? And is the solution as simple as allowing agencies to retain the proceeds of the sale of that property? And does GSA have the discretion to really allow agencies to retain the proceeds of a sale using their current authority?
So I'm going to start, and then I think Norm will pick up. I've seen over the last couple of years now more of an interest in agencies to basically unload their excess property, because with flat or declining budgets, what they're seeing is, you know, dollars going to underutilized excess properties, maintaining and safeguarding vacant properties, and that's a dollar that's not going to their mission and to, you know, citizen services. So I see more incentive on the part of agencies now to say, I need to find a way to either consolidate my facilities or release excess facilities, and more of those agencies coming to GSA saying, help me. And, you know, GSA has done, I think, a great job over the last 2 years, but again, it's within the limit of how many dollars they have to do it. So either the agency brings them the dollars, you know, through an appropriation, or, as Norm mentioned, a couple of agencies that actually have the authority to retain some of those savings, to use them then to queue up the next property for disposal.
I think Dave is right in terms of we are seeing more activity across the agencies, and the Reduce the Footprint directive from OMB, I think, is helpful that really to really focus our collective attention on the problem. That having been said, I think we all recognize that there's far more potential that we should be tapping into, and I bring it back to that whole notion of retention of proceeds. And where agencies have some ability to retain proceeds to recoup the costs of getting these properties off their books, you're seeing far more activity.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wise, you stated in the past that consolidating leases onto owned spaces might be the quickest way for us to save money in real property. What can the government do to reduce its reliance on even leasing?
Yes, I think that, again, this kind of tracks back to the data issue that we talked about a little bit earlier, because one of the issues we've seen in a number of our reports is that consolidation of leases is made more difficult by the fact that individual agencies don't always know what each other has out there. I think back to an example of one of my teams out in the field had been in a medium-sized city in Texas, and there was two small federal offices. They both could have fit together in one of them because one had really a very small footprint, but they didn't know the guy down the street had some vacant space. So that leads back to the idea that if there was greater transparency to the federal real property profile, agencies had more access to it, and it was more accurate. This would help facilitate individual agencies being able to look for opportunities to consolidate and move into federal space, in which case you would then reduce the reliance on leasing. So lease consolidation could be a very effective tool in terms of making both saving money and reducing the federal footprint.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a further question on freezing the footprint. As the chairman noted, This committee is working in concert with the administration to encourage as much freezing of the footprint as possible, but I noted that the GAO, Mr. Wise, has determined that some agencies are overstating, and indeed some of those that had the largest reductions are overstating their freeze of the footprint. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
Can you explain that? Is this a technical matter? Is it something beyond that? What are they trying to do?
Well, it was a combination of different things, Mrs. Norton. There were some technical aspects to it. There was some miscalculations of the measurements. There was sometimes it was a happenstance situation where things had been moving to begin with, but it happened to fall in that period when they were being asked to reduce a certain amount or freeze a certain amount, and so it kind of fell into that category. And there were also cases where it was just a simple situation where an agency might give back some of its real estate, but it would turn it back to GSA and claim it as a reduction, whereas actually it was a reduction to that particular agency, but in the aggregate sense, it was still part of the federal footprint. So in that sense, we concluded
It gave back some of its footprint.
But it turned it back. It didn't actually get reduced from the federal inventory. It got reduced from an individual agency, but it went to GSA to take charge of. And as a result, it was still part of the federal inventory, but the agency counted it as a reduction.
Yeah, but it is a reduction for the agency. If GSA doesn't dispose of it, that's another question.
Well, yeah, it's a reduction to that agency, but it's not a reduction in the aggregate sense. And so that's why we felt that because the statistics that the administration was presenting was an overall government-wide statistic. And as a result, we didn't feel as though that when we did our analysis, that we said, well, that's a reduction maybe for agency X, but it's not an overall reduction.
That's fair, Mr. Wise, I must say. It's fair in judging the inventory of the federal government, but I must say it does nothing to encourage an agency which reduces its footprint and then find that it looks as though they have overstated. And I would ask GSA to break out so that we know when the agency has done what we asked the agency to do, but GSA, for whatever reason, hasn't gotten to it. So it is not counted as if it is simply ignoring the footprint. To what extent does moving costs or other costs interfere with reduction of the footprint?
You're asking me?
I'm asking all three of you on that, starting with you, Mr. Wise.
Okay, well, I'll start off. Yes, it has an impact, and I think this gets back to some of the testimony that Dave and Norman had talked about a little bit earlier, and that's the fact that there are issues when an agency still has to, it sees a space where maybe there could be a potential for lease consolidation. Let's say, for example, there's a sorting facility from a post office that they're not longer sorting mail, but they still need the front end of the post office to provide services. However, that back end of it still would need a certain amount of investment or capital investment to make it suitable for, say, the other federal office down the street to move in there. And so who's going to bear that cost? That's an issue.
Well, that's my question. Is GSA authorized to front that cost and then build it into the cost of the lease?
I think that's exactly right. And what we're trying to do first and foremost is to identify the opportunity to move from leases into own space. Once we identify that opportunity, it's to figure out how you're going to fund the project. Mr. Mader talked about the consolidation fund, which we think has been huge in terms of our ability to help support more of these projects. We also have a program at GSA that focuses on the upfront costs of furniture and IT, and what we do is we finance those costs and allow the agencies to repay us over time.
So are you doing all the upfront costs that would be necessary for that agency to move into a smaller space?
There are still some costs that the agency would be responsible for, but again, what we're trying to do is...
Like what are those costs?
It would be certain tenant improvements, certain above standard requirements that would be on the tenant to pay.
You can't do anything for them. Well, that's going to keep them right where they are, Mr. Don. That's going to keep them right where they are. They're not getting enough appropriation, given the sequester and other reductions, to do much more than they're doing. So if they've got to put any money into moving, I don't know how you can expect an agency to reduce its footprint. I certainly wouldn't put, if I were an agency, I wouldn't put that up front. I'd put keeping my staff, keeping my agency running. So I don't see that you are enabling agencies once they have to come up with some money that good and well the Congress isn't giving them. I don't see how you are enabling people to reduce their footprint fast enough.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we're using all the tools at our disposal and all the flexibilities that we have to reduce any obstacle.
Why are the upfront costs for making the tenant adjustments in the facility not a part of what could be included in the lease?
Again, we're working to make sure that we have all the flexibilities and we're using those flexibilities. What we often see is that agencies don't want to use the credit card to pay for the entire move. They don't want to overextend themselves, so they would rather find the upfront cost to deal with it so that they're not paying over time. So what we do is transaction by transaction, agency by agency, try to figure out how we're going to solve the funding issue for that specific project.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to know what the number of agencies are who are able to move, given the fact that they have got to take care of the tenant, the cost of adjustments to the facility in which they're moving. I'd like you to send that to the chairman, please.
Happy to provide the additional details on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Are there any further questions? I'd like to thank you for your testimony. Your comments today have been helpful in our discussion. Thank you. We'll now call the final panel and witness. Maria Foscarinas, Executive Director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. I ask unanimous consent that the witness' full statement be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. My name is Maria Foscarinas. I am the founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. The Law Center is the only national organization dedicated to using the power of the law to advocate the legal rights of homeless and economically vulnerable Americans. Since 1989, Law Center attorneys have worked through state and federal courts to expand access to affordable housing, meet the immediate and long-term needs of those who are homeless or at risk, and strengthen the social safety net. Through our work, we have been fortunate to achieve significant progress in meeting these goals. In addition to securing and expanding legal rights for homeless Americans, we have worked with partners throughout the country to provide services to millions of homeless families and children. There's still much work to be done. Homelessness remains a crisis affecting too many men, women, and children across the country. Many of our nation's veterans are among those who are affected. One key federal program designed to assist homeless Americans is Title V of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1987. Title V makes HUD responsible for leading a cross-agency effort to identify unneeded federal properties suitable for use by homeless assistance organizations. Once those properties are available, homeless service providers have a right of first refusal to acquire the excess property. Title V has enabled service providers and local government agencies to acquire and use surplus property to provide meals, shelter, housing, job training, medical care, and mental health treatment, among other things, for homeless Americans throughout the country. Each year, more than 2 million Americans receive assistance through Title V. Title V is a proven vehicle for assisting America's homeless with no cost to taxpayers. In fact, in light of the focus of today's hearing, I want to emphasize that Title V saves taxpayer dollars by reducing operations and maintenance costs associated with unused and unneeded federal properties. But despite this ongoing success, the Law Center has identified a number of challenges. Most notably, as this subcommittee well knows, landholding agencies are all too willing to retain unneeded or underused properties. The Law Center has worked for over 2 decades to push federal agencies to identify all properties eligible for disposal under Title V. So I can say with certainty that the Law Center shares this subcommittee's goal of ensuring that surplus properties are put to better, more productive use while reducing costs to taxpayers. As we work towards this common goal, Title V must continue to be a part of the federal property disposal process. Title V is not the cause of delays. In fact, only those properties deemed by HUD as suitable for use to provide homelessness assistance are available under Title V. For this subset of properties, a Title V application process takes only a few months to complete. We've worked with Congress, HUD, and other federal agencies to improve and streamline Title V and improve the efficiency of the process. I would like to briefly highlight 3 areas that could improve the Title V program and save taxpayer dollars. First, property should be designated for disposal once it has been vacant or unused for 1 year. If an agency determines that a vacant property is still needed, it should submit a written explanation of continuing need, which would be available for review by the general public. Second, Congress should consider a more streamlined Title V application process. Property for which there will not be a homeless services application should be available for sale more quickly. At the same time, Title V applications should be considered more fairly and efficiently. Third, Congress should consider reducing unnecessary bureaucratic redundancy by providing one agency, HUD, with authority to grant or deny Title V applications. At the Law Center, we believe that the right to a home and food lie at the heart of human dignity, and we envision a world where no one has to go without the basics for human survival. Title V is a critical element of this vision, and I urge this subcommittee to ensure that any proposed modifications to federal property disposal preserve and enhance this essential program. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. As you mentioned in your written testimony, we share many of the same concerns. I believe we have the same problem and the same goals. Agencies are land banking properties. To address this, there needs to be some independent review and clear direction other than relying on agencies themselves. Would you agree? Would you agree with that?
Well, certainly there needs to be review. Yes, I agree.
I'm pleased with the discussion your organization has already had with this committee, and we look forward to continue to work with you on a solution that we can all agree on. Will you continue to work with us on this important issue?
Oh, absolutely. We would love to work with you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you.
And the subcommittee.
No, thank you. I recognize Ranking Member Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Madam Focarinas, in your testimony, you discussed the possibility of improving the disposal process by making HUD responsible for evaluating and approving applications for properties to be provided for homeless providers. Can you discuss this idea and how it could expedite the process of disposal?
Absolutely, Congressman Carson. So right now, the review process lies with HHS and HUD is responsible for the front end of the process, and then HHS takes over. We believe that the process could be streamlined if authority were vested in a single agency. We think HUD is the most logical agency. HUD has the most expertise on issues of homelessness, and so we propose reducing bureaucratic redundancy by vesting the authority in HUD.
And lastly, how would you describe the level of cooperation that homeless service providers have received from federal agencies with respect to how they report excess properties, and how could that be improved?
Well, I think a big problem for service providers is that they are not familiar with the process. There's a lack of information about what properties are available. So we believe that the agencies should, and GSA should comply with it. Well, GSA should comply with a court order and not land bank the properties, and report the properties that are that it annually deems excess to us and to the homeless service providers for use as properties to assist homeless people. But we also think that much more needs to be done with outreach. As the GAO recommended in its report, much more needs to be done to get the word out that these properties are available. Homeless service providers are not often reading the Federal Register. Much more user-friendly and accessible methods of outreach need to be implemented.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes. Okay. I'd like to, if there are any further questions, I would like to thank you for your testimony. Your comments have been helpful to today's discussion. If there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to again thank our witnesses again for their testimony today. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you.